Hey everyone, welcome back to AskAVC. My name is Ryan Floyd. I'm a managing director at Storm Ventures. In today's episode, we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity. I'm so excited to have Aubrey Blanche on the show. She's one of the leaders in the field. So let's get into it. I'm really excited to have Aubrey Blanche here with us today on AskAVC. She's currently director of Equitable Design, at Culture Amp, and before that at Atlassian. And it's an interesting title and background. So maybe, Aubrey, you can just start by kind of giving everybody some context of how you got here and what really does that mean in the context of Culture Amp?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I have a little bit of a funny title, and I will admit, if you even ask my boss, he gets my title wrong still. I've been at Culture Amp for a little over a year. He occasionally calls me the head of sustainability, which I suppose if you think that I'm the head of human sustainability, then it's not entirely wrong. So when I say that I'm the director of equitable design, really, what that means is that I'm the director that's in charge of helping us evolve as a company in a more equitable and fair way. So many other people would think of this as your chief diversity officer, for example, which was the position that I held at Atlassian. And then I was also in a D&I role at Palantir Technologies before that. So I've got about coming up close on a decade of experience working in both Silicon Valley, but then also across the Australian tech ecosystem, really thinking about how do we begin to develop new methods and new ways of thinking about building equity and fairness. So, and then therefore engendering diversity and inclusion within two companies in the tech and sort of VC and financial sectors. So lots of experience, but it's all really focused on creating equity and sort of equitable design, which is in my title, which you asked. It's kind of funny, but what that is that's the discipline of constantly thinking about and designing for equity, is that equitable design piece. And so when I came into Culture Amp, I demanded a little bit of an unconventional title.
I love it. Well, we'll get into that because I think, actions and design and process, there's so much of this. There's a lot of talk, and the talk is great. The conversation is great, but a lot of it's in the design and the process and how you actually implement and make things happen. But before we get into it, tell everybody a little bit about Mathpath and kind of what that means and what that's all about too.
Yeah, so the Mathpath is both my company. So I work with companies to develop their own DEI and cultural transformation strategies, as well as work as an executive coach with leaders to help them understand their own place in the equity and inclusion journey and help them think through the big things that they're working through from an equity lens. But I am the Mathpath, so that's a portmanteau of a math nerd plus an empath. And really where that comes from was a couple of years ago, I was looking to, I realized that I was lucky enough to have some people who looked up to me in the field. So in the field of DEI, it's very, very small. And I've been lucky enough to have, really career setting experiences being at Atlassian and being able to do a lot of really groundbreaking work there. I was lucky to be supported to do that. And so I realized that I wanted to have a point of view that was separate than what my company was. Not that necessarily they were at odds, but that, what Atlassian wanted to talk about didn't encapsulate everything that I wanted to share. And so the Mathpath has really come about as a way for me to just continue publishing my thoughts on things around DEI. So I just published a blog recently about why, your CEO can't be your chief diversity officer, which is something that people often say is, oh, your CEO is your CDO. And I'm like, no, that's not right. That operationally doesn't work. Like aspirationally, it has some good idea in there, but the actual logistics of it don't work. And so that's really what the Mathpath is about, is it gives me a space to continue ideating and thinking about all of these problems, but in a way that's a little bit less tied to my employer, so I can say whatever I'm thinking. Which it's like everybody in Silicon Valley has a blog. I don't have a Substack. I'm sorry. I just have a blog on my own website.
No, that's great. Well, everybody can go check that out. Well, so let's start with, I know when we were first talking before this discussion, some of the pre-conversation, I use the word diversity and inclusion, and you scribed that out and wrote equitable and equity. So let's start there. Like, why do you think about it in the context of equity and equitable versus using the words diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I do this to everybody, so don't think that you're the only one. This is just very much my style. So it's not that I'm like anti the goals of diversity and inclusion. So let's get that straight, that like conceptually we're all
Yeah,
living in the same
right,
island
right.
of wanting to get there. But what I've found over the course of my career is that the word diversity itself can actually get in the way of us making progress. And the reason is because I imagine you see this in finance or in venture. You know, if someone says, well, this is a great company.
Sure.
Well, you as an investor have almost no information about the company, right?
Right.
Other than this person thinks maybe they think it's a strong investment. Maybe they think that it's a company that's doing good in the world, but something that'll never make any money at all, right? Maybe they think it's a great company, but should be bootstrapped. Maybe they just liked the founder and likes the idea but have no interest in investing. And so I think the word diversity often works the same way as the word great in that sentence, in that it's really, really non-specific. And so most of the time when people say diversity, they're actually meaning sort of it in the broadest sense. We're looking for diversity in our company, or we're looking to increase, inclusion within our culture. But I think with diversity, it becomes so non-specific that it's actually really hard to action. So often people say diversity, and what they mean is gender equity, say, but they get credit because when we say diversity, and my research that I did in the 2018 State of Diversity Report at Atlassian actually showed that people associate the word diversity with two groups. So that's white women and Black Americans, both of which are groups that we think deserve to not have artificial barriers put up in front of them, right? But they're also not the only groups that are marginalized. And so the word diversity often gives us credit for doing Black equity work when we're not. We're doing gender equity work. And then also it causes us to miss other groups, say like groups with disabilities. And how are we thinking about supporting them in the workplace or creating inroads for that community to be more in tech? So I think the word diversity overall is, I always tell people not to use it because it's not specific enough. If that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
No, it
So
does. I mean, I think it's great. And I think, what's also interesting is, you certainly can find, when I was thinking about when you came back to me with that, you find some people that react really negatively to the concept of diversity. They think, oh, we are diverse or whatever. I find this sometimes in my conversations, and it's enormously disappointing. But I was thinking about that word equitable, and what's kind of cool about it is, who can argue with that? I mean, really, I guess some people could argue with that and say, yeah, we don't believe in equality or what, I suppose, but I like the concept because I think it includes a lot of different people in it. And I think it may help avoid like a lightning rod sometimes where like people immediately have like a negative reaction or react and say, oh yeah, we're already, doing some of these things. So anyway, I love it. Kind of
yeah,
more Gen
it's
2.
yes, Gen 2. And I love what you were saying. There's a study, this is just funny, but I'll share it here for our listeners. There's a study that came out of Stanford that showed, for example, that if people in a room are wearing different color t-shirts, so they're not changing their identities, but if a homogenous group of people put on different color t-shirts, people are likely to say that the room is diverse.
Oh, okay.
And so right, and you're
All
like
contact.
that's interesting, but
Yeah.
right, that's very silly. And the reason is because, again, going back to the idea that the concept of diversity is so non-specific, unless we're saying gender equity, or we're saying disability and access, or we're saying Black equity or Asian equity, or what are we talking about? Oftentimes that person says, well, we are diverse. What they're trying to say is, well, everyone here isn't a complete carbon copy of each other, which no one is trying to argue in the first place. But you end up in this situation where you're arguing at a premise that no one's actually, right? You're creating a straw man argument and then arguing about that, as opposed to equity, which is why I always put it in, because equity is a constant process.
Right.
Equity is a process, diversity is the outcome.
Absolutely. That's it's a great way to think about it. Yeah, and it's a funny study. Well, so I guess, getting into it about, where I'm coming from on this is, and I think this is great for us to talk about, I've been on this journey for, many, many, many years. And I try to do what I can with our portfolio companies. And I was having a conversation with another HR leader, and we were talking about the value of equity in terms of creating a stronger company, and in the context of potentially an outcome, M&A, and companies being interested in buying other companies, because it's a cultural value that they appreciate. It's a group of employees they appreciate. And, it's become, very important, I think, to a lot of companies. They don't want to necessarily acquire someone or, a company that doesn't have that set of shared values. And it can be very difficult, later in life as a company to try and instill those and so forth. And, so give me I know, when we talked about this, you have some very strong opinions and points on this. So let's start with that, about the reason that startups should care about equity, and, what are really the driving motivations behind it.
Yeah, so there are so many reasons, but I'll pare it down to a couple that we'll talk about and based on our conversation. So the first is you just want to you want to have the best chance of hiring the best possible people for your startup. And if you're creating an environment where only a small number of people feel welcome or feel comfortable, you're automatically sort of restricting the talent pool that you can hire from, which, especially in startup land, right? We're dealing with a set of people who have a very different set of motivations than those that go to big companies, right? So we're talking about smaller companies when we're talking about startups in VC. And so I think that's number one, is just you can't have the best talent if you don't have an inclusive culture that's welcoming to all people. So, for example, if you have a culture that thrives on people making fun of each other and making jokes, well, that requires a level of familiarity. There's a lot of people who got teased as kids that don't want that in their work environment, right? Or you have a culture where if someone has a major community trauma event, so let's say like at Culture Amp, our Asian employees felt obviously really impacted by the terrorist attack in Atlanta. And if you have a culture where people can't talk about those experiences and they can't bring them into the workplace, then you're again going to be creating a workplace where certain types of people just can't thrive. And because most startups are they're working with knowledge workers, right? So we're working with people who we want to maximize their cognitive performance, saying, well, certain of our employees are going to have these huge cognitive loads from not being welcome, feeling belonging uncertainty, feeling stereotype threat. You're just not going to get as high performance out of your organization. So that's the first one. So you're artificially deflating the talent pool that you can hire from, which isn't a great idea as a founder or as even an early employee at a startup. Second, you're going to get less out of the people that you do hire that you have there. And then there are other downsides of what happens when you have an imbalanced team or a homogenous team. So what we know is that homogenous teams are worse at problem identification. So they actually don't decide to solve problems that are there as often. So they're more susceptible to groupthink. So they kind of all go along with each other's ideas. We tend to do this with people that we're similar to no matter what. It's just that we're tending to deal with straight white men and Asian men to some extent in our industry compared to others. And then also a group of people who are similar to each other are simply going to have like less developed solutions to problems. So if we all, let's say, came out of Stanford, no offense to Stanford or anything, but if we all got taught by the same professors, we're all going to have a very similar like problem solving toolbox. That makes any sense to you as a metaphor?
Yep.
And then when you add on to that, if we have similar sets of life experiences, that means that our informational toolbox and our problem solving toolbox, all of a sudden, right, all of the boxes start to look similar. And so what you end up with is a lower performing team than you would have otherwise.
Right. 100%. And, so what we're really at is you're able to hire more people. You're able to motivate them and make them happier at work, which they're going to perform better. And you're going to come up with likely more creative, more thoughtful ideas for the business simply by having that population of people there.
Absolutely. And you won't end up, and I was going to say, and you won't end up with the Pepsi can commercial where Kendall Jenner solved racism by giving cops a drink.
Right. Sure.
So I would say you're going to come up with better solutions, but your culture is probably also not going to be doing some majorly tone deaf stuff.
Right.
Too.
That's right.
So it's both positive, positive innovation on one side, but also not negative innovation. So it's both harm reduction or risk reduction, and then it's also about sort of this greater likelihood of innovation and of moving forward.
I mean, and obviously the another you left out, but what I love about all of this is it's just the right thing to do, right? So
yes, also that.
Yeah, also that. I mean, all of these things. What I love about this conversation in general, and really pushing companies to do more, is that there really is no reason not to. If you're interested in building the best organization that you can, these things are critically important going forward. And another important reason is, younger workers today fortunately care so much more about this than I think. Certainly, I'll speak. Sorry, I should say white older workers care about this. If you look at the majority now, I think it seems to me there's a change in terms of how people value this too. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's not only you're going to be able to hire a larger percentage of unrepresented workers in your company potentially, you're very likely going to be able to hire a higher caliber of, say, white male workers too over time, because they're going to value that as well. And it's just the right thing to do. So you're building a stronger company and doing the right thing all at the same time. It's very hard to make an argument not to it. I mean, do you ever run into in your, you don't have to name names, but I mean, it must be, I'm sure you do at times, where people push back on you and they say, Aubrey, this is great, but it's not that important, or, I don't really see what I mean, do you hear things like that, or is that no longer?
I hear of those things, so I don't tend to be in conversation with people that hold a lot of those explicit attitudes, mostly because they don't seek me out. But I do hear that. I think there's lots of people for whom they do not think this is important. I think all over the tech industry, there are people who think that, tech is a meritocracy, and if your code runs, there's no such thing as bias. And there's no data to suggest that those people are correct, but they do exist and they are out there, and they do try to ban political conversations from their companies. And, I think about that a lot, actually. What I tend to see more often is the people who, in theory, believe it's important. So they're like, I'm all in on this. I want my company to be diverse. I want my company to be inclusive, but it never quite makes it up the priority pyramid.
Right.
So it's important, but it's priority number 11.
That's probably a better way to put it. Right.
Yeah, it's very rare that I get someone that's like, oh, screw this.
Right.
No. Most people are good people who right, because as you said, the other reason, and I didn't even get into this because we're talking about VC, and so I'm going for the financial argument, is this is the right thing to do as people. This is the kind of business and the kind of atmosphere that we want to build in our companies. But I think that's part of it, is people often think that it's a lower priority. And I think that's mostly with diversity. I think with inclusion, one of the things I try to focus on and try to get startup founders to understand is that it's a way of working. It's not always changing what you're doing. Yes, certainly you need to create space for those hard conversations when they come up. But a lot of what inclusion is making sure that people are invited to the meetings, making sure that there isn't that guy who constantly interrupts everyone. I was just speaking to a woman who came to me for some help. So my DMs are just full of people who want advice on how to work through different problems at work. And I try to help where I can. But, she said to me, she's like, there's this guy, he's just a jerk to everyone. He's rude. She happened to be a woman of color, so she felt it really acutely. She's like, but I'm not the only person who's doing it too, but he also makes misogynistic jokes. And, what can I do about this situation? And it wasn't that everyone else on her team didn't think inclusion was important, right? They did, but they were like, what do we do in this situation? The answer is go to HR, by the way, in that situation. The answer is go to HR,
right.
Talk to them, get support for it. But I think It's things like that. So inclusion is something that, it's not that it's free. It does take work and effort and time, which isn't free, but it's about having respectful meetings. It's about bringing people into a community when they start and making them feel welcome. So it doesn't always have to be these big ticket, big budget, set piece sort of HR things, but inclusion really happens in the little things about how you conduct your business throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's so much, as oftentimes the conversation around the difficulties that so many people have in the workplace comes down to like fundamental issues of just a lack of respect. Just, basic like human um, interactions that, yeah, it's not some big initiative. It's not some big budget affair. It's people treating each other, in a respectful way that makes everybody feel, included. And that's not to say there's not going to be oversights. People don't get invited to me, but it's so often it does, come down to that. And it is frustrating to hear those stories where, yeah, people feel like, what are they going to do? They, maybe they don't want to go to HR. Maybe they, they just want it to stop, or whatever the case is. It is tough to hear those stories. What, a lot of the people who watch these videos, they're founders of companies and have the ability to make an impact in their own organizations. They struggle, like you said, with time. Everyone's strapped with time. They don't have, they for sure don't have anyone like you on the team yet, right? What advice would you give them in terms of, how they should think about equity? How should they think about building their culture, early so that they set themselves up for all these great things that we just talked about?
So I think the first is, one, start educating yourself. So between all of these great books that have been written in the last year, like if you just look at what was trending in the New York Times bestseller list in like July 2021, 2020, that's a really good foundation. So lots and lots of books about race and racism. And I think that starting with learning about race and racism is one of the most powerful things that you can do. In my mind, racism is sort of the deepest layer of all of the exclusion problems. And so if you learn about that one, you will learn a lot about gender exclusion, about homophobia and transphobia, although there's certain things to learn about that as well. So the first is educate yourself. I would also, so if you use social media, go audit your social media and ask who you're following and what voices you're following. Because you could be really, most people unintentionally are following everybody who looks like them or everybody who looks like the majority, because the algorithms often do not help you out with that. So you need to fight them. But that's one thing I would do, is so educate yourself on sort of the big issues, read Dr. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, but also think about educating yourself through personal stories. So follow people who don't look like you on social media and listen to what they're talking about and what they care about, because you'll find some of the solutions to those problems are right there. Sort of this person saying, this is what I need at a company, whether that's inclusive onboarding, or whether that's way of running a meeting that takes into account people who are, let's say, more introverted or quieter. You'll learn a lot from listening to people. So that's the first thing I would say to do. The second I would say is start networking. Start diversifying your network now. So the best time to do it was last week or yesterday or last year or 10 years ago. But if you didn't do that, it's like the best time to start it, to plant an acorn, was 30 years ago. Right. And the next best time is right now.
Right.
So that advice still works in this situation. And so that's what I would say is, find a way to start connecting with the communities that you want to seek equity for. Now, it can be really easy to burn yourself out and say, like, I want to help everyone all the time. I don't necessarily think that that's what you need to say, but maybe what you say is, I need to have a greater network of racially underrepresented people. So you'll identify a meetup or a speaker series that's targeted at that group. Start attending those, start understanding what's of importance to that group. And start there. I have there's a leader at Culture Amp who on Fridays sends a message to one or two people within his sort of field, who are underrepresented, who just says, hey, is there any chance that I can support you in your career with some mentorship? I've been in this career for over 10 years. Is there anything that I can do um, to help? And it turns out that he's gotten some responses back that are like, no, but thank you. Like, I'll let you know in the future if anything comes up. And some people who he's actually ended up spending time with. And so I just offer those as a couple of different ideas of how to expand your network. Go to events like there's a group called Black and Brown Founders if you're looking to make sure that your entrepreneurial sort of your entrepreneurial journey, your entrepreneurial network is more diverse. So I would say go and so one, educate yourself, two, sort of start to diversify your networks, and three, start sourcing early. So those I always say networking second and then sort of sourcing as a second one because those networks that you're building that are more diverse are going to give you keys to give you the keys to hiring more diversely, right? Because you and people on your team. So I'm saying this to the entrepreneur, but I think this is something that you can build into the expectation of everyone is everyone on my team has an inclusion goal. My company is literally just me and my business manager, so it's not a huge team. But we have, because we're both marginalized people ourselves, we have personal wellness goals. So to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves as marginalized people, part of that is having personal wellness goals in addition to our business goals.
I mean, that's great. And going back to what you said about, the networks and then leading into sourcing, I think it's great advice because I hear from so many founders, they want to, I mean, I think generally they want to hire a more diverse workforce. They want to hire more diverse executives, the board, but it can be hard if they have no network or anything to draw from. And then it might feel like, people say, oh, it's a pipeline problem or something like this when it probably isn't. It's probably just a function of, their ability to source from, the networks that will provide them with the candidates that, could be a great fit for for the business. So I think that is great advice and a good way, a really good way to, to start. How about,
And I was going to say, I think you're also speaking to something that's really important, which is we've often talked about diversity sort of within a startup, but I think there's also something really to be said for also thinking about diversity within your investors or on your cap table. So sort of being intentional about working with investors who have diverse networks as well. So if you're going to a big institutional firm that has a bunch of white and Asian dudes, there's nothing wrong. I'm sure there's very talented investors there. I don't want to, but are they going to have the network that's going to help you amplify your startup?
Absolutely.
I think that's part of it. I'm a part of Operator Collective, which is, a VC firm that's really changing the game. Sort of our LPs are predominantly operators. So they also serve as the advisory network, but we have 40% people of color as LPs in this venture firm. I think it's like 90% women or something like that. It's most of us are women. And so I think there's also something about just counseling founders to also go work with VCs who are making this a tier one issue for them.
Absolutely. That's right. Because you're going to find those investors are going to be more supportive of all of those things that you're trying to do with the business. There's just going to be a lot more alignment in terms of, general support. So what the question is, it's a great segue. So the question I was going to ask is, what is your advice to venture investors? What's your advice to someone like me who's in a position who's invests in all of these startups? What other things should they be doing to be making this happen? I mean, we're not, and before you answer, I mean, we're not, as a venture fund, I'm not in a position where I can mandate anything, right? Because I'm not in a control position with companies. But I do think, investors have the ability to influence a lot of these cultural values and can help make things happen. So what advice would you give to venture investors to try to do more?
Yeah, I think first is make sure that how to pitch you is known and available and out there. So there's lots of different ways to do this. So I know there's a lot of angels so Lolita Taub, who leads the community VC, She has a registration for funder. It's a funder founder like matching tool. I think she made it in Notion or Airtable or something equally impressive. But sort of if you're an investor, making sure that you're available in tools like that, or that your website has sort of a succinct way that lets people in a formal and sort of a complete way pitch you. So making sure that it's not just that, oh, I met you at a coffee shop, or a friend of a friend's, kid from Harvard,
Right.
because no, I like rag on Stanford as if I didn't go there. So I just want to say that like I'm allowed to rag on Stanford
Okay,
because
I
I
went
went
there
there.
too.
I'm not.
So yeah, I get it.
So so
Equity.
I'm like I have my master's from Stanford, but my point being that not all smart people went to Stanford, which I think we know is true. But I think that's a part of it, is as a VC making sure that you're accessible.
Yes.
So Kport Capital has it where you have to pitch Kport, you have to fill out the form on their website. So they make sure. I know that, for example, Miriam at Ulu Ventures uses algorithms to determine which companies that they're funding. So that's what I would say is one. I would also say to VCs, track your time. So I know of tools that are doing this. One called Sunfleck that's coming out of Europe, but it's looking and saying, how are you allocating your time? Let's say your goal. Now, you don't have to do this as a mandate for other VCs, but you could set yourself as a goal and make yourself an example for the rest of your firm to say, well, last year if you invested in 5% companies with female founders, maybe this year that number you want to be 20%. And then audit your calendar to say, well, am I spending enough time with female founders such that I would expect to be able to write checks for, 20% of my investments this year are going to female founders? Because I think this goes back to what we talked about with diversity and inclusion, which is diversity is this sort of it's nebulous and it's fuzzy, and we probably shouldn't use it. But if we're going to, we think about it as an outcome. And so that's what I would say to VCs is look at those particular steps in your process of who you're meeting with, how you're meeting with them, how are they getting to you. And if your deal flow sucks for a particular type of founder, like solve it in the same way that you would, right? You would go out, you would network, you would meet people. Now, you have to make sure that you're making a good impression, right?
Right.
That sounds very silly,
Right.
But that's a part of it. But I think that's it, is really focus on the process of building an equitable investment pipeline. So equity at the early stage, can someone find you? Do they know how to pitch you? Maybe you're fine taking a cold pitch in a DM in your Twitter. I don't know. Live your life.
No, I think
that sounds like chaos to me.
It's such a simple thing. You're right. I mean, access is so critical, and I've done a video on it. And I tell people all the time, you can cold email venture investors. I mean, and venture investors should respond to cold emails, with the caveat being kind of your point about, how you approach the whole problem. The emails just need to be succinct and matching what that venture investor is looking for. But venture investors ought to be looking at those inputs, because you're right, that increases access, and that's one way you're going to build a more diverse portfolio for sure.
Yeah, and I think as a venture investor, you can also be clear in public about what you want to see in a pitch, right? So
Yep.
if you're a founder who you're like, I care about the team, like the team is what I invest in, like make sure that's on your blog, make sure it's on your bio, there are different ways that you can make that, but so make it clear to people what they need to do to approach you successfully. And that doesn't mean that you're going to write a check, although I think there are some really smart investors who are thinking about what is the maximum spray and pray method of capital allocation, which I think is interesting, which is just give money to every underrepresented founder and you're going to get some hits.
Right.
I think that's a compelling investment thesis, but I don't have the capital for that. I'm just an angel investor. But that's something I would say is is your deal flow diverse? And if not, why not? Go to those founders that are underrepresented, that are in your portfolio or in your network, and say, who do you know?
Right.
Here's my thesis. Here's who I'm looking for. I want to make sure that I'm not missing anyone from underrepresented communities because my network isn't built out yet. Is there anyone you can introduce me to? I think that's part of it. This is what VCs are great at, is network building and relationship building, and so they need to allocate those skills towards DEI as well.
How about given your experience at Atlassian and now Culture Amp, on the operating side, are there some things you tell, venture investors or founders for that matter that, maybe don't have the infrastructure that you've got, that, outside of the networking and sorts of things that are, sort of, I don't know, low hanging fruit, for lack of a better way to describe it, that easy to implement, but has big impact that, everyone just ought to be doing right now?
Yeah, so I think getting a formal performance system in place as quickly as possible. So this sounds really silly, but I think one of the things that often happens in startups is that the extra labor that underrepresented people are doing has nowhere to go or nowhere to be captured. And so by putting in a formal performance process, you can actually start to outline what is valuable and what is important. Um, uh, like what is important at your company. So you could literally build into the performance review process like inclusion actions, right? You could choose that to be something that's actually required as a part of working at the company. And so that's what I would say is get your sort of performance systems in line early and write those so that they incentivize the kind of cultural outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, because I think too often, folks kind of push that off and, keep everything very informal, which, won't necessarily drive to the goals that you want to drive to.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I said, like, I think that with diversity and inclusion is there's so many, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, or equitable design, whatever we call it, there's so many different ways for everyone to participate. And so by building into your formal performance process, sort of credit culture amp, we have a part of the performance review that's called amplify others. And so it falls into that is how are you amplifying others in terms of creating an environment where they can thrive. And so that's how we do it. And we're now a 500-person startup, but we started doing that back when we were quite a bit smaller.
I love it. That's great. It's great. Well, Aubrey, thank you. Listen, I appreciate all the time. It's such an important topic, so I appreciate all the insights. Thank you very much, and hopefully we can do it again soon. Thank
Yes,
you. Thank you
this
so
is
much.
so much fun. Thank you for having me on. It's always an honor to get to chat and to have such a good conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right.